Hey guys, KinoFlex here, back with another response video. Right off the bat, I want to be very transparent that my reasons for making this video aren't simply to dunk on a bad video essay, it is also to condemn a very specific unhinged individual who goes by the name the S.E.A. In the wake of the political assassination of American conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, a number of absolute monsters have not only justified his horrific killing, but they are also advocating for continued violence. The S.E.A. is one of such ghouls as he publicly celebrated Charlie Kirk's death on the Discord server of Sheaf Talks, where he serves as a moderator. In the server, S.E.A. attempted to justify himself by bringing up several out-of-context headlines and outright lies regarding Charlie Kirk, which I will cover briefly. Not necessarily to try and convince you to subscribe to Charlie Kirk's viewpoints, but more so to provide the objective facts of what he specifically said, because if you're going to justify someone's death, you should at the very least know the facts. To begin, he says that Charlie Kirk justified death so long as the Second Amendment was maintained. This is very misleading, as he is suggesting that Kirk's position was that victims of gun deaths somehow deserve to be victims of gun violence as some sort of sacrifice. Kirk's point was that not having the Second Amendment not only would not save these victims of gun deaths, but it would also allow for more people to potentially die by leaving them vulnerable without a firearm. He has never said that victims of gun deaths deserve to die or that we shouldn't look for ways to prevent them from dying. I'm going to play a segment from a speaking event he attended where a question was raised regarding the Second Amendment that has been repeatedly clipped out of context by people trying to justify Charlie Kirk's death, where he does provide solutions to victims of gun violence, specifically children in schools.
How's it going, Charlie? I'm Austin. I just had a question related to Second Amendment rights. We saw the shooting that happened recently, and a lot of people are upset. But I'm seeing people argue for the other side that they want to take our Second Amendment rights away. How do we convince them that it's important to have the right to defend ourselves and all that good stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So I'm a big Second Amendment fan, but I think most politicians are cowards when it comes to defending why we have a Second Amendment. This is why I would not be a good politician, or maybe I would, I don't know, but because I actually speak my mind. The Second Amendment is not about hunting. I love hunting. The Second Amendment is not even about personal defense. That is important. The Second Amendment is there, God forbid, so that you can defend yourself against a tyrannical government.
Come on.
And if that talk scares you, wow, that's radical, Charlie. I don't know about that. Well, then you have not really read any of the literature of our founding fathers. Yep. Number two, you've not read any 20th century history. You're just living in Narnia. By the way, if you were actually living in Narnia, you would be wiser than wherever you're living, because C.S. Lewis was really smart. So I don't know what alternative universe you're living in. Yep. You just don't want to face reality that governments tend to get tyrannical. And that if people need an ability to protect themselves and their communities and their families. Now, we must also be real. We must be honest with the population. Having an armed citizenry comes with a price. Wow. And that is part of liberty. Wow. Driving comes with a price. 50,000 people die on the road every year. Wow. That's a price. You get rid of driving, you'd have 50,000 less auto fatalities. But we have decided that the benefit of driving, speed, accessibility, mobility, having products, services, is worth the cost of 50,000 people dying on the road. Wow. So we need to be very clear that you're not going to get gun deaths to zero. It will not happen. Right. You can significantly reduce them through having more fathers in the home, yes, by having more armed guards in front of schools. We should have an honest and clear reductionist view of gun violence, but we should not have a utopian one. You will never live in a society when you have an armed citizenry and you won't have a single gun death. That is nonsense. It's drivel. Wow. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year, so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational. Nobody talks like this. They live in a complete alternate universe. Sure. So then how do you reduce? Very simple. People say, oh, Charlie, how do you stop school shootings? I don't know. How did we stop shootings at baseball games? Because we have armed guards outside of baseball games. That's why. How did we stop all the shootings at airports? We have armed guards outside of airports. How do we stop all the shootings at banks? We have armed guards outside of banks. How do we stop all the shootings at gun shows? Notice there's not a lot of mass shootings at gun shows. There's all these guns because everyone's armed. If our money and our sporting events and our airplanes have armed guards, why don't our children?
So there's lie number 1 from C Refuted.
He needs some milk!
His next claim is that Charlie Kirk justified the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, and that the attacker should be rewarded for doing so by having someone bail him out. This, again, is another claim being posted without any sort of context, because if you look at the podcast episode where he said this, you'll find that he is clearly suggesting that as a joke, while immediately condemning the attack in his next breath, and pointing out the hypocrisy of San Francisco's bail system, where violent criminals are repeatedly released, putting more people in danger. But once politicians are targeted, the same rules everyone else is subjected to suddenly don't apply.
Politico says top Republicans reject any link between GOP rhetoric and Paul Pelosi assault. Of course you should reject any link. Why is the Republican Party, why is the conservative movement to blame for gay schizophrenic nudists that are hemp jewelry makers breaking into somebody's home, or maybe not breaking into somebody's home? Why are we to blame for that exactly? And why is he still in jail? Why has he not been bailed out? By the way, if some amazing patriot out there in San Francisco or the Bay Area wants to really be a midterm hero, someone should go and bail this guy out. I bet his bail's like $30,000 or $40,000. Bail him out and then go ask him some questions. I wonder what his bail is. They're going after him with attempted murder, political assassination, all this sort of stuff. I'm not qualifying it. I think it's awful. It's not right. But why is it that in Chicago, you're able to commit murder and be out the next day? Why is it that you're able to trespass, second-degree murder, arson, threat of public official, cashless bail? This happens all over San Francisco. But if you go after the Pelosi's, oh, you're let out immediately. Got it. And I want to reiterate for all the degenerates that are watching that cover our story, we do not endorse political violence. We're a movement of peace and of love and of truth. And we hope Paul Pelosi recovers.
The point isn't to say that Paul Pelosi's attacker should be released so he could commit more awful attacks. The point is to ask the same question of why do we not have the same deservedly harsh standard applied to other violent criminals and give them the opportunity to reoffend. A good example of this would be the recent killing of a Ukrainian refugee by a repeat offender who has been arrested more than a dozen times, including for armed robbery and assault in what appears to be a hate crime. Ultimately, Charlie Kirk is saying that we shouldn't hold the Pelosi's to a different standard simply because they're rich and one is a politician. We should ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, is safe by keeping known criminals imprisoned. That's lie number 2 from C Refuted.
He needs some milk!
Next, he cites Grok for a series of claims which I find pretty funny because instead of doing actual research, he outsources that responsibility to an AI owned by Elon Musk. Like, bro, don't you hate both of those things? Why would you cite something you yourself wouldn't accept as a source of information? Regardless, we're going to tackle each of these claims one by one. He wasn't necessarily against the Civil Rights Act, but he was critical over it being way too broad to the point that it's used by bad actors to act as though they're the victims of discrimination, despite that objectively not being the case. Biggest example is disparate impact laws, where someone can claim with no evidence whatsoever that they are a victim of discrimination for whatever reason if there's any amount of disproportionate outcome that's not in their favor and punishes people for not hiring or associating with someone, even if there's no proof that they did so out of discrimination. It's essentially the argument of the gaps fallacy, where people claim that a disproportionate outcome experienced by one group can only be caused by racism and nothing else, which is an absurd premise as it dismisses any other possible cause.
Do you support the Civil Rights Act?
In spirit, but not how it's written.
Why?
It's too broad and paved its way for the persecution. For example, they're using the Civil Rights Act to put men in locker rooms like Riley was in.
How? Which article?
Article 4 or 5, I think. I actually don't know specifically, but the Civil Rights Act is being used for by the trans movement right now as because they say that they are women, therefore they demand an accommodation of women's rights. Riley can riff on this. They're using the Civil Rights Act literally to have access into men female locker rooms.
So what would you change about the Civil Rights Act?
I wouldn't make it as broad. I would make it much more crisp and concrete, and I wouldn't have it necessarily I would also get rid of the disparate impact component of the Civil Rights Act. So the biggest problem with the Civil Rights Act, there's four components of the beast of anti-racism. There's affirmative action, DEI, disparate impact, and then, of course, there's a fourth that I'll remember in a second, which is basically disparate impact is that it must be racism if two different groups have different outcomes, which, of course, is outrageous. Disparate impact is the legal theory that undergirds most of the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act.
The most important takeaway is that Charlie Kirk criticizing aspects of the Civil Rights Act does not make him an advocate for Jim Crow laws. All it means is that he wants an improved Civil Rights Act that does what it was intended to do, which is to ensure fair opportunities. The next claim is one that is being used by both the far right and the far left to justify their anti-Semitism, where Charlie Kirk making an appeal to wealthy Jewish donors who fund political causes to reconsider who they give money to somehow translates to the Israeli government having a reason to take him out. There's no evidence whatsoever linking the shooter to the Israeli government, so this lie needs to be nipped in the bud before it becomes an even bigger lie. Moving on from that though, we need to address the just as idiotic claim that Charlie Kirk was at all being anti-Semitic here, because what he was actually doing was the complete opposite. Again, Kirk was simply acknowledging that according to voting demographics and various reporting, it is a fact that Jewish Americans are more likely to support Democrats and other left-wing groups in general. The Biden campaign was loudly and proudly supported by mega-donors who come from a Jewish background, and some of those same mega-donors are funding anti-Israel causes. He's trying to convince liberal Jews that the ideas being funded by either them or other people in their party goes against their interests, and that they should join hands with Republicans instead. It's literally no different than him and other conservatives trying to get black Americans to leave the Democrat plantation, or having gay Democrats switch parties with the Walk Away campaign. He's trying to get the approval of the Jewish community, and while the execution of his approach can be critiqued, it's not factual whatsoever to say that he was being anti-Semitic. Finally, I want to address his use of the term cultural Marxism, because this is an obscure term that's getting called anti-Semitic when it once again isn't the case. Leftists like to repeat a debunked claim that it's not an academic theory from the Frankfurt School, and is actually an invention of the Nazis. But if you actually do research, you'll find that left-wing academics actively use the term cultural Marxism to refer to their own ideas and ideology. Specific examples I found are Richard R. Wiener's 1981 Cultural Marxism and Political Sociology, Cultural Marxism in Post-War Britain by Dennis Dworkin, Conversations on Cultural Marxism by Frederick Jameson, and Cultural Marxism and Cultural Studies by Professor Douglas Kellner. And it's important to note that Jameson and Kellner literally made their respective careers on being cultural Marxists who studied and taught the Frankfurt School's brand of Marxism. So if the left-wing argument is that cultural Marxism is a term created by the Nazis and used by far-right conspiracy theorists today, this is just factually wrong considering the number of Frankfurt School theorists who have used the term to describe their own ideas, specifically political correctness and multiculturalism. And if someone in the audience wants to try and counter me by bringing up the Wikipedia page, it should be noted that the page is completely unreliable because it was changed by the politically biased moderators on the site who constantly change articles to fit narratives of their choosing. Fortunately, I have the original page archived and leave it in the description. The bottom line is the theory of cultural Marxism that was taught and spread in universities is not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Therefore, Charlie Kirk is not an anti-Semite for criticizing it. The next claim is essentially accusing him of being homophobic, when he had made it clear time and time again that he had no hate towards members of the LGBT community and even welcomed them as friends within his own organization.
I'm a gay conservative, and I just want to kind of ask you, like, what do you have to say for people like me who kind of feel like, I guess, it's kind of hard for gay conservatives because there's not a lot of us, so, like, what do you have to say to other gay people who need to realize, like, they do have a choice?
Yeah, first of all, welcome to the conservative movement. I don't think you should introduce yourself just based on your sexual attractions.
No, I agree. I like
because that's not who you are.
I like to be thought of as a person, and
for sure, you are a complete human being, and I'm sure you treat people well, and you're studying something. So I want to get away with this idea that you're gay anything. I just think that we have gone a long way in the negative direction in this country, where we act as if the most important part of your identity is what you do in the bedroom. It doesn't mean that much to me, but if you ask from a perspective as a Christian, I don't agree with that lifestyle, but politics is about addition and multiplication. I imagine you agree with a lot of what we talk about.
Absolutely.
Right? Strong borders, strong country, and for that, we welcome you into the conservative movement.
Thank you.
Grok mentions him being against LGBT rights, but being the shitty AI that it is, it never specifies what exactly said gay rights even are, which only leaves us to speculate what the fuck is even being talked about, since the term is so vague. And again, him having gay friends does in fact prove that the narrative of him treating gay people as a disease wrong. And if his gay friends aren't bothered by his stances on gay issues, then doesn't this show that these issues are more complex than people give them credit for, as the gay community doesn't have a consensus on these issues? Just putting that out there. I already covered the lie that he justified gun deaths, but to hammer that point home even more, I'm going to bring your attention to a research paper that found that almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million, in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008.
You stupid fucking idiot! In your own screenshot, you show that some scholars disagree with the numbers you're highlighting, and that the numbers are actually around 108,000. Did you even read your source?
Yes, if you read my screenshot, you'll notice that the more conservative estimate from some other scholars is radically lower than the numbers I am going with based on national survey estimates. But let's say that I go with these numbers instead. My argument still doesn't really significantly change because the number of defensive uses by firearms is still much more than overall gun deaths. Not bringing this up to say that this number is good because the number should be zero, of course, but the fact is that gun owners do in fact rely on their firearms for self-defense, and will use them to prevent crimes or tragedies from occurring, oftentimes without even firing. Gun violence is absolutely a serious issue in America, but demanding that all gun owners turn in their firearms or else they're culpable in continued gun violence is as stupid and deranged as saying that there is no issue with gun deaths in the country at all. Regardless, any conversation on gun violence needs to also take into account the amount of lives gun owners save per year. And even if this following accusation wasn't said by S.E.A, I'm going to address it anyway because of how stupid it is, which is the lie that he used an anti-Chinese slur towards an audience member when the truth is that he was yelling at Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks.
Charlie Kirk's death has led me to an uncomfortable conversation that I want to facilitate. To my white brothers and sisters, how would you hope your minority friends respond to the celebration of Charlie Kirk's life when he has very publicly said things like this?
I live like a capitalist every single day, Cenk. I live as a capitalist.
Refer to Asian individuals by the C word, a word too violent for me to even utter.
If your jaw dropped after witnessing that absolute stupidity on display, give yourself a pat on the back because congratulations, you are a normal person with a functioning brain. Unfortunately, that can't be said to the over 100,000 people on X taking this lie at face value. If you actually believe that Charlie Kirk is saying a slur here, I do not care what you have to say on any given subject. It doesn't matter how impressive your educational background is, I am going to disregard it outright because you either acknowledge that he didn't say a slur or you lie and say that he did, thus losing any and all credibility you have. Does S.E.A or anyone else who hates Charlie Kirk so much have any ounce of respectability to at least acknowledge that this isn't true? I sincerely doubt it since he said in his server that if Charlie Kirk is defended in any way whatsoever, it will result in a ban. And if you think that S.E.A cares about this celebration of loss of life being spread in his server of more than 1,000 people, you'd be wrong because he himself appears to be publicly celebrating Charlie Kirk's passing.
Keto, why are you trying to get people canceled for their free speech? You're being that one friend who's too woke right now. And if you're woke, then you're gay. And if you're gay, then I'm going over to your house, spreading your butt cheeks, and going
Look, people are allowed to hate Charlie Kirk and his ideas. I personally take issue with some of his positions on geopolitics, more specifically on Israel's handling of Gaza, and I'm willing to hear out from S.E.A himself so he can give clarification on what exactly his stance on political violence is. But to say that this does not at the very least come across as celebratory is delusional. At no point does either he or S.E.A outright condemn political violence, as they instead just double down on their positive reaction to his passing. And if your argument is that what they're doing isn't celebratory simply because they don't think what they're doing is celebratory, I have to push back on that because people can either lie or, again, be completely delusional by not acknowledging that they're celebrating his death without even realizing it. A good recent example would be the Bob Villain fiasco where the dumb frontman of the duo unambiguously celebrated his death but still denied doing so.
Yo, real quick. At no point during yesterday's show was Charlie Kirk's death celebrated. At no point whatsoever did we celebrate Charlie Kirk's death. I did call him a piece of shit, that much is true, but at no point was his death celebrated. If it was, go find me a quote, go find me something that proves that we were celebrating his death. You're not going to find it.
I want to dedicate this next one to an absolute piece of shit of a human being. pronouns was, were. Because if you chat shit, you will get banned. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk, you piece of shit.
It doesn't matter if this guy is lying or genuinely doesn't know what it means to celebrate something. He is completely unrepentant over expressing his joy that a man tragically lost his life, which is completely fucked up. And this is exactly what I'm seeing from S.E.A and Sheev, who instead of at any point clarifying that Charlie Kirk dying is a tragedy and denouncing political violence as a whole, they double down in very bizarre ways. In Sheev's case, he lashes out at critics by calling them evil for abstaining from voting and mocks their religion. Yeah bro, you're really owning those Christian chuds with your wholesome Chungus atheist worldview by justifying murder. Fun fact, if you look up evil degeneracy on the random superpower wiki, you'll find a picture of Sheev. I also find Sheev's callous disregard for human life to be incredibly ironic, considering he's relying on other people keeping himself alive. Guys, don't have sympathy for innocent people I hate dying, but please, oh please, have some sympathy for me because I don't deserve to die. It's moral hypocrisy at its finest. C's doubling down wasn't much better as he got dog-walked by some random guy on the server who correctly pointed out that his behavior is something you'd expect from a fascist.
You got knocked the fuck out, man!
C of course banned the user because he couldn't argue against him, and as justification, he tried to conflate his experience as a YouTube reviewer to being the arbiter of acceptable morality and politics. You don't understand, guys. The only reason people aren't agreeing with me is because I'm just too smart for them. It totally has nothing to do with me acting like a complete nutjob. But since he wants to go that route, let's tackle one of his most popular videos, the odd phenomenon of villain worship, which by itself is already a pretty bad video, but it becomes so much worse with all this added context. I've been holding off on responding to this video because I couldn't find the right time, but I knew when I first saw it that I would make a response to it one of these days because throughout his video, C makes broad sweeping claims about everything being morally clear-cut, but requires a lot of addendums and clarifications on his end. Some people's first response to this video would be to say that obsessing over villains or having them as role models isn't missing the point because of the rule of cool, where if they aura farm enough, they can do no wrong. I'm taking a different approach because that's frankly just as flawed of a stance because it just places feelings above an actual understanding of the plot. I'm not going to accept some random freak saying that the pedophile villain in a movie like Happiness from 1998 is someone who should be admired or justified in what he does because they interpreted him raping unconscious kids as something cool. How my stance differs from that is that if you objectively look at a film's plot and find that the villain's motivations are more coherent and well-defined than the heroes or any other alternative offered to them, then it makes complete sense to say that they were completely in the right regardless of how the film wants you to feel about them. And that perfectly describes my thoughts on most of the examples C chooses for his video. An artist can obviously misunderstand their own work. To say that they never can, you have to actually believe that no one has ever failed to communicate something without realizing it. In other words, his entire video's premise is incoherent from the get-go.
Villains in fiction are meant to represent everything we're not supposed to be.
Villains in fiction represent everything we're not supposed to be. Lots of things are wrong with this sentence. For starters, it all depends on the story because there is not one correct way to write a villain. For instance, a villain can have characteristics and traits that are admirable to have while other traits not so much. The same can be said of heroes as they go through character development. And again, it also all depends on how competent the writer is, because they can unintentionally make the villain have more of a point than the hero. The point is, C doesn't address the idea of morally ambiguous or complex stories. He doesn't at all consider tragic heroes, anti-heroes, anti-villains, etc.
They show us what happens when selfishness, cruelty, and power lust go unchecked.
Okay, and what about all of the other villains that don't possess those qualities? And I'm going to quibble with him using selfishness here because being selfish is not inherently immoral. Selfishness is considered immoral when you are doing so at the direct expense of other people in an unethical fashion. It is not immoral for someone to prioritize their own needs over others for their own self-care and well-being. Another thing to consider is that you can be selfless and also commit acts of evil. Some of the worst crimes of this century were done under the idea of helping others. Millions died in famines caused by communist states who believed that collectivized farming would be better for society. The worst atrocities have been committed by those who want to protect their families, clans, nations, and even in the name of abstract ideas. A suicide bomber, for instance, kills himself in the name of his ideals, which can be described as a selfless action as he will die in doing so, but just because the action is selfless doesn't at all make him morally right. I would say S.E.A's inability to understand this is his biggest flaw when it comes to his own personal ethics.
But lately, there's been this weird trend where audiences start siding with them. Instead of recognizing villains as cautionary tales, people twist their motives into something more relatable or admirable. Suddenly, the bad guy is misunderstood or had a point, even when their actions are downright horrifying.
I don't see why that's a problem whatsoever. You're allowed to interpret fiction differently and consider things that the author of a given story didn't. A good example would be the Disney movie Wish. Yes, the villain Magnifico who grants people wishes is presented as evil, but because the movie was so badly written and not well thought out, it made him the guy you end up siding with if you considered the plot for even 5 seconds. He is somehow evil for not wanting to grant everyone's wish, but not all wishes are good. Bad people make wishes too, and even a well-intended wish can cause problems. The movie never provides a counter-argument to this glaring problem, because at the end of the movie, people can grant their own wishes. The movie just sort of pretends that this won't end in a disaster within a matter of days once people figure this out and actually start using that power. When your story is ill thought out, it naturally makes the characters presented as unreasonable look reasonable.
This trend of villain worship isn't just frustrating, it's disturbing. It suggests that people are missing a major point in many stories, which is to inspire us to be better. Heroes in fiction exist for a reason. They're meant to show us what to aspire to, even when the world is unfair or broken. When audiences start rooting for villains instead, they're not just misrepresenting the story, they're undermining the entire message.
The message.
S.E.A. and the critical drinker are two sides of the same coin in their obsession in whatever a film's message is. In Drinker's case, he overlooks positive qualities a film can have if he doesn't like a message. But in S.E.A.'s case, he's incapable of handling criticism or even different interpretations if they come into conflict with whatever message a film he enjoys has, or convinces himself that it has. Guys, I'm begging you to understand that you can enjoy a film without agreeing with the writer's interpretation of the story.
Transformers 1 introduces us to the original form of Megatron, D-16, before he ultimately became the tyrannical leader of the Decepticons. The film shows his origins as a working-class guy who never wanted to get involved in any massive changes of the Cybertron system, until he got roped into a grand conspiracy by his best friend Orion Pax, learning the truth of their leader, Sentinel Prime, giving away the energon he spent every day of his life slaving away to extract, to the Quintessons, Cybertron's ancient enemy. Instead of thinking what he could do to help rectify the issue for all of Cybertron, he thought exclusively of how he was personally wronged. The entire rest of the film from that point forward was a further descent into darkness after acquiring a taste for power, further being enabled by a group of freedom fighters who have an ideology based around the strength of one bot over another. This further fed into the blood-hungry attitudes of D-16, until he had the chance to kill Sentinel. Many people seem to think he was right in executing Sentinel Prime, but they fail to understand that no one individual should have the unilateral authority to execute a surrendering and unarmed opponent. Those are the roots of fascism. Looking at Megatron as some noble revolutionary who acted rationally with consideration for others is horribly misguided, and shows how little people think of the impacts of the actions of others. Are there corrupt systems in place in the real world? Absolutely. But giving all power to one person to choose who lives or who dies arbitrarily in accordance to their own personal ego is a horrifying stance to have.
One of my first videos I uploaded to this channel was a positive review of Transformers 1, and while that is still a film I quite enjoy, I will acknowledge that a major flaw in it, besides Bumblebee being annoying, is that even though Megatron becomes the villain he's widely known to be by the end, it's very abrupt and questionable in a way that it contradicts his characterization somewhat. Megatron's primary motivation is carrying on the legacy of the Primes who he idolizes. He even idolizes Sentinel Prime until he realizes that he sold out their race to the Quintessons and enslaved him and the other, which makes killing Sentinel pretty difficult to disagree with since his entire existence puts everyone on the planet in danger. It also makes Optimus or Orion look pretty dumb for constantly getting in Megatron's way to an extent.
No, D, we can't kill Robot Hitler in our coup attempt, or we would be just as bad as him!
What are you talking about? You're already killing nameless grunts without giving them trials, so why suddenly have this standard for the one guy causing the entire conflict? What if he manipulates the jury with propaganda like he did with the entire population previously, and goes back to running everything exactly how it was? Killing Sentinel is a valid solution because it's an active step towards fixing the problem, while keeping him alive would only complicate things further. The real example of Megatron being in the wrong was when he betrayed Orion and decided to destroy Iacon for no reason. Sure, Sentinel ruled over Iacon, but you can still change everything about it now that he's dead. There's no need whatsoever to destroy everything, especially when you still need to fight the Quintessons. Megatron hates Sentinel for betraying his heroes and killing them. but later he betrays and tries to kill his best friend. Megatron wants to keep the legacy of his heroes alive, but also wants to destroy the city that they built and swore to protect. Megatron wants to liberate his fellow miners from tyranny, but now wants to punish them by becoming a tyrant himself. These changes in his character aren't sufficiently justified, and the primary reason people tend not to mind is because they already associate Megatron with being evil in all of his other prior appearances, which is a huge cop-out in the same way of having Daenerys killing innocent people in the final episode of Game of Thrones, because that's the ending George R.R. Martin intended despite not laying the proper groundwork to have an ending like that in the show. The writers should have tried harder to flesh out Megatron's motivations more, because in the process, it resulted in people having conflicted feelings on a character intended to be unambiguously evil.
And that no one individual should have the unilateral authority to execute a surrendering and unarmed opponent.
It should also be noted that Sentinel is literally always armed, since he's a living weapon. This is pretty much a John Walker situation because this guy's just too dangerous to take any chances with. And it's only amplified because none of these characters are humans, so it's pretty silly to hold them to the same standards as humans. Next up, he talks about Avatar, which unlike Transformers 1, is a movie I can't personally stand.
What if we have the opposite? Sometimes the villain isn't a person wanting to upend the system, but the system itself, like the RDA in Avatar. The RDA is the ultimate corporate villain, representing greed, exploitation, and the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. Their goal is simple: mine Pandora for unobtainium, no matter the cost. To them, the Na'vi are just obstacles, and Pandora's lush ecosystems are just another resource to be harvested. What's scary with the RDA is how realistic they are. In the real world, corporations and governments have justified similar actions in the name of progress or profit. That's why it's so unsettling when some viewers argue the RDA is practical, or they're just doing what needs to be done. This line of thinking echoes the same excuses used to justify deforestation, general environmental destruction, and genocides against different ethnic groups. But Avatar isn't subtle with who's in the right. Jake Sully and the Na'vi represent the harmonious way of living that respects life and the planet. The RDA, on the other hand, is a cautionary tale of what happens when humanity loses its connection to nature. Rooting for them, or even sympathizing with their goals, completely misses the point. This is a universe with a canon deity that connects all living things on the planet. So killing the planet is killing an actual conscious entity. Many people even argue that humanity needs to survive by the time of the Way of Water, so the RDA must colonize Pandora, right? To that I'd like to ask, why did Earth get to that point in the first place? Why should history repeat itself with a species that had zero say in the matter of what humanity does to their planet or Earth? One of the messages of this film is for us to get our shit together because our planet is pretty neat and we should preserve it instead of ruining it for future generations.
This is a completely insane takeaway because Jake Sully and the Na'vi are among the most unlikable protagonists I have ever seen put to screen. I am provided with no sufficient reason to side with them over humanity. Even with Quaritch and the RDA being bad guys on the surface level against the Na'vi, there's not much discussion or evidence in the films of the RDA and its goons being bad guys on an abstract level. And this point is only amplified in the sequel, where the Earth is stated to be running out of resources to sustain itself. Prioritizing humanity's survival in the face of the apocalypse, rather than some alien species who refuses to cooperate to help, is by all counts a good thing. Especially when you take into account that it's not simply the people in the RDA, but general humanity as a whole who had nothing to do with the Earth becoming how it is.
Ever wonder why some characters are written without much depth? Because there isn't any depth to be had with topics like this. If this message is lost to anybody with how abundantly clear the messages are, I have no words.
Jake betraying his own race, the Earth dying, humanity having no choice but to do anything they can do to survive. None of these facts are addressed or refuted in any meaningful way, which is very poor writing if we, the audience, are expected to root for Jake and the Na'vi. All we get is a very lazily written nature preservation allegory that puts the well-being of nature first and humanity second. Moving on to Dune.
But what happens when the villain is who you've been following the whole time? Paul Atreides from Dune is pretty neat. He starts out as a heroic archetype, a young man thrust to a dangerous political conflict who rises to become the messianic leader of the Fremen. But what if the Messiah had other plans? What if destiny had darker ambitions? By the end of Dune 2, Paul is no longer the noble savior he appeared to be. He becomes consumed with the weight of his role as Quadit's Hodderich, knowing that his rise will lead to a galaxy-wide jihad in his name. Fans often argue that Paul is justified because he's trying to navigate a no-win situation, but that ignores the fact that his actions still led to immense suffering. He does still make choices that hurt others.
You can't just bring up Paul's lack of agency in his decision and leave it at that. Because what was the alternative for Paul in this situation? The only option presented to him in the film was to either let countless people die along with himself and his family, or unite all of the Fremen against the Harkonnens with the Jihad. The reason people have this dumb opinion of Paul being a mustache-twirling villain when he's more complex than that is because Denis Villeneuve played scary music over Paul and tries to get the audience to side with Cheney as if she has the right idea in telling Paul to not go through with it. Which end up being the worst parts of the film because Villeneuve completely changed her character into being less likable as an author's pet because he didn't trust us to understand that Paul isn't Luke Skywalker. Fortunately, it's entirely possible to watch the film with the interpretation that Cheney is being a dumb bitch who doesn't realize that Paul doesn't really have a choice, which is the point. While it's true that the Fremen are Paul's servants, they would kill Paul and the people he cared about would die if he didn't accept his destiny. Dune isn't about conflict being unnecessary, it's that conflict is ultimately always going to be inevitable whether we like it or not for survival's sake, with different kinds of people using power in an amoral fashion all the same.
Paul's story is meant to critique the idea of messianic figures and the dangers of absolute power. It's a warning, not an endorsement, but many fans see Paul as a tragic hero, someone who's justified in his choices because the system around him is so broken. This kind of thinking shows how easily people can excuse harmful actions when they sympathize with the character committing them. He might be the protagonist, but he's no hero.
Mr. Media Literacy over here, funnily enough, misses the entire point of Dune, because Paul has to be somewhat of a traditional heroic figure, as the message is to be critical of hero worship in general, no matter what form they come in because of how downright impossible it is to do the right thing on a massive scale. Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, said that the bottom line of the Dune trilogy is to beware of heroes. It's much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes. So in that sense, Paul can be a hero based on Herbert's interpretation, which doesn't at all conflict with the point of the story, since the idea is that you shouldn't be an uncritical follower to even your own heroes. In other words, the message C is claiming to understand is actually one that goes against the entire point of his poorly thought out video. Finally, we have Senator Armstrong. And no, I don't care about his other example he brings up because I haven't watched Pirates of the Caribbean past Curse of the Black Pearl.
Finally, there's Senator Armstrong for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, the deranged politician who wants to create a world where only the strong survive, tearing down institutions and systems in the process. His ideology is a brutal and exaggerated form of social Darwinism, blended with a distorted sense of American exceptionalism. Advocating for a world where only the strong thrive, rejecting traditional systems of government and morality in favor of raw power and individualism. Armstrong believes that societal systems like democracy and law have become corrupt and ineffective, manipulated by the weak to control the strong. He envisions a world without nations or ideologies, where people fight for their own survival, supposedly ensuring freedom and strength through perpetual conflict. Despite his claims of wanting to create a better world, his rhetoric exposes a callous disregard for human life, revealing that his vision is less about justice and more about imposing his violent philosophy on the world. Ryden even points out how Armstrong's views don't mean shit, considering he was born rich and powerful, never knew any struggles, while Ryden himself was once a child soldier, still grappling with the psychological damage of his experiences in adulthood.
Anyone who has actually played the game you're talking about would concede that Armstrong's philosophy of might makes right had a point to an extent, considering Ryden ultimately ended up agreeing with him, as you need some level of power to protect yourself and to enact positive change.
You've guaranteed the status quo will go on. For a while longer, at least. War will continue as an institution, as an industry. Men will fight for reasons they don't understand. Causes they don't believe in.
The breathtaking program is finished, but the larger company is not, I'm afraid. Someone will buy them. PMCs are in demand once again.
Yeah. Fighting for reasons they don't understand. Causes they don't believe in.
Beg pardon?
No. Nothing.
Armstrong's plan is essentially hyper-individualism on steroids, which would only cause a total free-for-all and cause problems. Ryden, though, represents Armstrong's ideals of someone able to carve out their own path by using their strength, while disregarding everyone else's rules.
So, your mind is made? You will not come back.
Sorry, Boris.
I understand. But then, what will you do?
I've got my own war to fight.
This is why even if Armstrong isn't able to get everyone to literally fight for what they believe in, he dies satisfied knowing that Ryden and people like him will fight for their own beliefs no matter what, through his strong will, which vindicates his views on strength, but not his plan.
The rise of villain worship says a lot about how people view the world. It's easy to be entertained by villains. They're confident, powerful, often reflect frustrations with broken systems. But glorifying them misses the bigger picture. Villains aren't meant to be role models. They're cautionary tales, showing us what happens when we give in to our worst instincts, and what can happen when we leave others unchecked with their greed. Heroes, on the other hand, show us how to rise above those instincts. Characters like Optimus Prime, Jake Sully, and Will Turner aren't perfect, but they'll fight for what's right even when it's hard. They remind us that being a hero isn't about being flawless, but it's about choosing to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it is. Heroes show us why they're worth fighting for. It's time we started paying attention to that message.
Whoa! Heroes are meant to fight for the right thing? No way, you're telling me this for the first time! My only response to this is to bring up a quote from Frank Herbert.
Don't give over all of your critical faculties to people in power, no matter how admirable those people may appear to be. Beneath the hero's facade, you will find a human being who makes human mistakes. Enormous problems arise when human mistakes are made on the grand scale, available to a superhero. And sometimes you run into another problem. It is demonstrable that power structures tend to attract people who want power for the sake of power, and that a significant proportion of such people are imbalanced. In a word, insane. Heroes are painful. Superheroes are a catastrophe. The mistakes of superheroes involve too many of us in disaster. It is the systems themselves that I see as dangerous.
Hero worship can be dangerous as they can cause us to rely on flawed people and sacrifice our own critical thinking instead of forming our own ideas and worldview to solve issues. They don't necessarily have to be bad people, but they can still be wrong from time to time, which is why we should have the confidence to disagree with the vision they put forth if we view it as half-baked or bring unintended consequences. I find the inclusion of my response to S.E.A.'s video to be necessary because it communicates clear hypocrisy all throughout if you contrast his morals with his reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination. Executing a guy who literally enslaved your race is bad, humanity risking their lives to secure resources for their dying planet and population is bad, defending yourself along with an entire group of people from being genocided is bad, acknowledging that having power and using it is necessary to enact any sort of change whatsoever is bad, but some psycho killing a guy for debating college kids is worthy of celebration? What the hell? This man named C, this C-man, if you will, is the exact stereotype of every bad video essayist who gets routinely mocked. He claims to be open-minded, but is actually extremely closed-minded if something doesn't adhere to his narrow point of view. Most of his analysis, if you can even call it that, can be summed up as him recounting a film's plot and buying into a film's framing uncritically, even if the framing isn't at all justified. And he puts on a lame, exaggerated voice. These are all honestly aspects you can shrug your shoulders at because there's so many other channels exactly like this. But something I just can't ignore is his celebration of political violence. I received messages from people telling me that I shouldn't defend Charlie Kirk because of things he said, but I can't help but defend him when the reasons people bring up for hating him are completely misleading or wrong. Whether you liked him or hated him, Charlie Kirk was a human being no different from you or me. I'm not going to sit back and let people with sizable followings radicalize their audiences into having the same mindset as Kirk's assassin, as we should be coming together despite our differences, not at each other's throats, because no good will come from that.
When people stop talking, really bad stuff starts. When marriages stop talking, divorce happens. When civilizations stop talking, civil war ensues. When you stop having a human connection with someone you disagree with, it becomes a lot easier to want to commit violence against that group. What we as a culture have to get back to is being able to have reasonable disagreement where violence is not an option.
But hey, those are just my thoughts, and if you have any of your own, feel free to flex them off in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.